What is the OSR, and how has it influenced the direction of Dungeons & Dragons? We're going to talk about it today on Daddy Rolled a One. Please help support Daddy Rolled a One by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, tote bag, or notebook. I have a bunch of new designs, including the new D10 and D12 patent designs to join the patent designs for the D4, D8, and D20 that I already had. So please head over to the shop. There's a link in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video on my series of tabletop role-playing game reviews, I guess, kind of. It also straddles a little bit of history. And I'm not going to be reviewing a specific game or product today, but rather what I'm going to be doing is offering an overview of a genre of gaming known as the OSR, and why it's important to discuss the OSR in the context of how it ended up influencing the direction of Dungeons & Dragons, including 5th edition. So if you are maybe a new gamer, you might have some preconceived notions about what the OSR is and who plays it. And I'm hoping to dispel some of those preconceived notions today, or at least explain why they exist in the first place. But really what I want to focus on is sort of 3 different areas in today's video. So I'm going to be talking about the history of how the OSR came to be, sort of the context behind it, why it was created, and a little bit about sort of the people, but more just kind of about the culture at the time that it was starting to develop. Then I'm going to talk briefly about how it did end up sort of influencing the direction of the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which as of the time of this video is 5th edition. So many people might not be aware that there are OSR influences in the game of 5th edition. And there are some OSR people that might not be aware of that as well. And then at the end, I am going to talk about, some different kinds of products that sort of, broadly fall into this umbrella of OSR. Okay, but to start with, then we need to sort of define, what does that mean? What does it mean? What do these 3 letters mean, OSR? So most people would say, well, that's very easy to figure out, because really what it stands for is old school Renaissance. That's how I first encountered the term. It was probably around, I think it was late 2008, or it might have been 2009. Right around the time that I was starting my new company, my new business, and my daughter was going to be born later that year. So I heard it as Renaissance, and that is, what a lot of people think it is. However, you will have other people say, no, it doesn't stand for Renaissance. It stands for old school revival. The R stands for revival. And then you'll hear other people say, no, the R stands for revolution. And then you'll hear other people say, no, it just stands for rules. OSR means old school rules. Well, the reality is it actually means all of those things. And it's not prescriptive. It could stand for other things. So there is no single true one size fits all definition of the OSR. And again, because it means all of those things, you'll start to see why I'm saying that as we go through this video. For the most part, I'm probably going to end up just calling it the Renaissance, the old school Renaissance, because again, that's how I was introduced. And I do think it's sort of the most common definition of the game. But again, there are those who will hold on to those other definitions. And then there's this community of the OSR and the people who played and promote these style of games. And again, I think that there's kind of these notions about who those people are, and most people in their heads, especially if you don't play those games, if you're a new gamer and have interacted maybe with some people in the OSR and in social media, I think there's this perception that they're all old people with long gray beards and they're all men, and then they, and they're dogmatic about this, wanting to play this style of game, and derogatory. A lot of times those people are called grognards. I don't think that should be a derogatory term, but it's usually used in that manner. But then there are a different group of people that play OSR games that kind of tend to approach it more from the creativity aspect from the layout, from the design, and from the art, and pushing the envelope, but still adhering to an old school style of play. And that can sound a little bit confusing because I think a lot of people have a perception that the old school renaissance, the OSR movement, is about recreating specific older editions of D&D, and that's sort of where the definition sort of stops. And that's not actually true. So that's why the OSR community has fragmented. And in fact, there are arguments just like there are in any other community of any kind of fandom: Star Wars fans, comic book fans, 5e fans, whatever it is. There are people within that community that disagree with each other about what this thing is and what makes it cool. And so my point here is that don't have this notion that it's all old guys with beards. I technically fit demographically into that, except I don't have a beard. um, but I didn't start with what most people would consider. I didn't start playing with what most people would consider as being an old school game. I started with a later edition. I started with this. And there are some people will say, well, this is old school, but there are just as many people in the community who would say, no, this isn't old school. So I know that probably sounds confusing, and I think it will just make sense then if we talk about the history. Let's talk about the history of why there's these kinds of discrepancies and start to understand where the old school movement, the OSR movement, came from. So obviously we have Dungeons and Dragons, the original set published in 1974, the original 3 books, okay, and then supplements. So this is written by Guy Gax and Arneson, as you see here. And I'm going to go really quick here. I'm not going to cover every single little step along the way. Otherwise, this video would be even longer than normal. And you already know that my videos are very long if you've watched my channel before, which thank you very much for doing so. And if this is the kind of content that you enjoy, I'd really like to ask for your help by liking the video, subscribing to my channel, hitting the bell icon to get notified when I post new videos, and then please sharing it on your social media networks. That just helps a ton, helps my channel grow, and I really appreciate it. So because we're not going to be able to discuss all of the different steps along the way, I'm just going to hit the main beats. All right. Now, there is a really great series on the OSR. It's on a blog called the OSR Simulacrum. And I'm going to put links to it in the show notes below if you really want to get into the nitty gritty. It's like a 5-part series, and they're very, very long each part, which is something, of course, that I enjoy. So I did get some ideas for this video from that. However, I'd sort of already, I was sort of there, not at the very beginning, but kind of close. Again, if you think about the old school movement sort of really kicking off with 3rd edition. And again, this is a simplification, which was 2000. I heard about it in 2009. It's now 2024. So um, uh, what kind of happened was you had this game, and then Gary Gygax publishes from 77, 78, 79. He publishes the new game, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, this is the player's handbook from 78. And if these editions are confusing you, please see my video on the history of D&D editions. It's for my channel. It's very quick. I think it's roughly clocks in about 20 minutes, and it covers what I say are all 18 editions of the game up until this point of time. But AD&D comes out, okay, in the late 70s, Advanced D&D. And flash forward to 1985. And a couple of books are published, and I meant to pull them off the shelf, and I didn't. But we have talked about them before. So Unearthed Arcana is published 1985. And then probably most significant for these changes is a book called Oriental Adventures. I'll just put a picture up here because I forgot to grab it from the shelf. Published in 1985. And it introduces a very significant change in the game, which is the introduction of non-weapon proficiencies or skills. And again, I have 2 different videos on skills and how they came into D&D. They're both approaching it from a different standpoint, but you can learn more there. So I'm not going to get into it here, other than to say it was a pretty significant change to the game mechanics. Now, what happens is as you move into the late 1st edition era, which is like the late 80s, mid to late 80s, non-weapon proficiencies become more and more a part of the game, even though they were technically optional. Okay, then you have the publication of this book, Player's Handbook and the other players, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monstrous Compendium, it was called, for second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And in this book, this is not written by Gary Gygax. And in this book, they do have non-weapon proficiencies. Now, it is described in here as being an optional system. And my understanding is that Dave Cook, who is the primary designer behind this game, this edition, he considered this not to be a replacement to Advanced D&D, as much as like an expansion and adding some modular components that you could tack on to a first edition game. So stuff like the skills, or again, they were called non-weapon proficiencies, very cumbersome and clunky name, but that could be tacked on to this game, which was already happening because they had been introduced while this game was still being published, first edition. Okay, but again, a lot of people didn't like that. Okay, and while it was described in here as being optional, in these supplemental books that came out, especially like they're called the complete guides, and they had like the complete book of fighters, the complete handbook of wizards, like that kind of thing. All of those relied on the fact that you were going to be using skills or non-weapon proficiencies. I keep using those two terms because they are interchangeable, but some people didn't like that. So even in the second edition era, which a lot of people would say, well, that's old school, there were people who didn't like the things that were happening in this game. There were other changes made in this game. I'm only talking about non-weapon proficiencies, but there were other things as well, things removed from the book because they thought that it was going to create a situation where they could be attacked by, children advocacy groups. Like there was a group called Bothered by Dungeons and Dragons, or Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, things like that. So they took out like demons and devils, and they took out half-orcs, and they took out assassins and all this kind of stuff. And they were trying to make it a little bit more family friendly. That didn't really affect the mechanics of the game so much, but it affected the feel and how it looked and how people thought about it, because it was trying to be, again, a little bit more approachable for families. Okay. So now we're going to get into the 2000s, and you have the release of the third edition Player's Handbook. So this is the one that's published by Wizards of the Coast after TSR has been purchased by Wizards of the Coast, moved to Seattle. And this game is published, and it does change the mechanics a lot. There's a lot of changes in here. I'm not going to get into all of them right now. That would be another video, but substantially very, very different. So, and not just in mechanics. So if you look at something like, if you just look at the progression of the art. So I always say this is my favorite AD&D cover. This is by David Trampier, and it's a wraparound cover, but it shows a party of adventurers doing what D&D adventurers do. They've clearly killed some kind of maybe lizard man or something, whatever it is. This guy's wounded. This guy's pulling the body off. These guys are grabbing some loot. This guy here is cleaning his sword. Okay, these guys are looking at a map, and then you've got these thieves up here trying to pry this gem out of this idol here. This is a classic D&D adventure in progress, like a game that's happening. And then you get to third or second edition, and no longer do we have a party. We have basically a single hero. Yeah, there's some people back here, but they're way in the background. You have this warrior here. This is an excellent painting. It's Jeff Easley. I love his art. But it changes the tenor of the game because this is the Player's Handbook. So like you're thinking this is what the game is. So you're not adventuring here and like cleaning your wounds. you're riding forth on your steed, with your cape blowing in the breeze. Okay, and then you get to third edition. Now the cover doesn't really, it was designed to make it look like a magical tome, but when you get into the art style in here, and you look at some of these characters, like. It's very different. The art is very different, and it's going to get more exaggerated as we go on in the third edition and the 3.5 era, where all like spiky things are going to, like weapons are going to get bigger, and it kind of changed. The aesthetic of the game changed, and that also was combined with the mechanics changing to where people kind of were thinking, I'm not sure that this is for me anymore. Now, third edition sold really, really well, and it did bring a lot of lapsed gamers back into the game, and I'm one of them. So I had stopped playing during the second edition era. I was mostly playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay with some friends, and then, college happened and work started, and I went for a little while without playing. And third edition is what brought me back. I've talked about that on the channel before. But one of the things that happened was you had these message boards for people to communicate in a way that they hadn't done before or weren't able to before. So you had people from all over the world that were able to log on to these message boards and start chatting about things that were important to them where they couldn't do that before. And you started to see people talking about playing these old school games. Now, another thing that happened during this time was that when third edition came out, there were companies that had held on to that sort of older vibe, that older aesthetic of the games. And so something like Necromancer Games, as early as 2000, the same year that this is released, they start publishing games, and their slogan is third edition rules, first edition feel. And they designed their adventures specifically to kind of harken back and be an homage to those old school adventures, to bring in those old school gamers and kind of say like, yeah, we're making stuff that you guys will like because the content is things that you will appreciate even if the rules are this. Okay. And they had a pretty neat little niche in there where they were doing that kind of thing. The reason that they were able to do that is because when this is released, and this is important for the future of the OSR, when third edition was released, a man by the name of Ryan Dancy, worked for Wizards of the Coast, convinced the people at Hasbro, who by this point had purchased Wizards of the Coast, that they needed to create an open game license. So the open game license, or OGL, allows people from other, self-publishers or third-party publishers to create material using the mechanics from D&D that are detailed in the SRD, or systems reference document. I'm sorry if you already know this, but I know there's people watching who don't know this, so I'll be brief. But there were companies that were able for the first time to legally use the mechanics behind Dungeons and Dragons to create new material that would be, that would work with that game system. And Necromancer Games was one of those companies. Okay, so the other thing that happened right around this time was that there had been a long-running cartoon. I talked about this just briefly in another one of my videos, in Dragon Magazine, called Knights at the Dinner Table, by the folks at Kenzer and Company. And when Wizards of the Coast decided to publish the Dragon Magazine Index CD-ROM, I've showed that on the channel here before. It included PDFs of the first 250 issues of Dragon Magazine and the entire contents, which included all the artwork and all of the cartoons. And they technically didn't have legally the rights to do that because the rights were assigned for them to publish it in the magazine. And I don't know if someone just made a mistake, or they maybe they read the contract and thought that it was okay to do that, but in whatever case, they didn't have the ability or the legal right to sell it as an electronic publication the way that they did. And so, and I heard this directly from, I used to work on advertising for Wizards of the Coast right around when third edition came out. And so my client told me the story that the folks at Kenzer and Company came to an agreement with the folks at Wizards of the Coast about certain things that could happen. And as far as how Kenzer and Company could use D&D like stuff and publish it. And one of the things that they did was publish a game called Hackmaster. And this is sort of a parody game based on the game that's played by the people in the Knights of the Dinner Table cartoon. Okay, so they play a game called Hackmaster, not Dungeons and Dragons, but it is essentially Advanced Dungeons and Dragons dialed up to 11. And that's what Hackmaster is, but it includes all this parody language to make it a little bit more fun and goofy. But mechanically, it's Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition. And so that game got out there. And now by this time, you have to remember, this is early 2000s. Advanced D&D first edition, this edition, has now not been published for over a decade. And this stuff was hard to come by. Okay, so there were no PDFs back then of the original games, the original adventures and the rule sets. There were no legal, also say no legal PDFs. And it was also even hard to find, illegal PDFs. It's not something you thought about. Okay, so the only way to get stuff like this was on the secondary market, which would be very, very expensive, just like it is today. It was less expensive then, but still, relatively speaking, it seemed very expensive. And so Hackmaster was a way that people could kind of like get a little taste of what it was like to play first edition if you've never played it before. And it was cheaper than trying to buy the old books, the original books on like say eBay or whatever that is. Okay. So that was one of the things that happened during that time period. Okay. Then you had other companies kind of jumping on board to publish stuff in a like manner. So another one was called Troll Lord Games. Okay. And they published a game in 2004 called Castles and Crusades. Okay. And it has gone through many editions. I don't even know which one this is, but essentially what this game is it's very stripped down third edition mechanics. So it is like a roll a d20, roll high versus a target number, ascending armor class, base attack bonus, advancing in the same way. But it does it from a standpoint of being wanting to emulate original or first edition advanced D&D kind of aesthetics and vibe with third edition mechanics. So similar to a way what Necromancer Games is saying, except Necromancer is publishing adventures that were intended to work specifically with third edition. Troll Lord published this game. This is a brand new game system based on third edition a little bit, but like incorporating a lot of stuff. So what's going to end up happening is Gary Gygax himself ends up working with the folks at Troll Lord. And what I have heard said is that Gary said that this version of the game, Castles and Crusades, is what he would have done had he been able to stay with the game, like how he would have changed the game over time. So, we all know Gary kind of changed things with hindsight over time and kind of he retconned some of his statements. But it is true, Gary worked with the folks at Troll Lord, and a lot of the stuff that he ended up doing later in his career of design work ended up being used or written for the Castles and Crusades system. Okay, so you kind of have this swirling perfect storm, probably not the best way to describe that, but things are happening that are going to help to propel the creation of this OSR movement. So, we just talked about Castles and Crusades. All right, now, something else that's happening, I just briefly mentioned this a second ago, was the message boards. Okay, so this is sort of like before social media is really a thing. So you didn't have other ways to kind of connect with people, but these message boards were a way to do that. And one of the ones that was very influential in this creation of this movement was one called Dragon's Foot. And it was sort of like they became known as like the home of TSR-era Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. And that's where people would go and leave messages and talk about like different parts of the game that they liked and things like that. And they would share experiences and create content. And it was this very like, community-like experience. But one of the things that happened is, again, I told you there's factions within even something is, and I'm going to say the OSR is niche. If you look at the total number of gamers, OSR is, it's a percentage, it's a fraction of that entire pool. Okay. So, but even within that, of course, you have to have people that are going to argue about things. And one of the things that happened was that there was a segment of people in Dragon's Foot that said, like, no, it's not just TSR era D&D. It's not this. Okay. It's also not anything that was published after Oriental or after Unearthed Arcana. So no Unearthed Arcana, no Oriental Adventures, no Dungeoneers and Wilderness Survival Guides, all that stuff. They're like, nope, those weren't written by Gary. Unearthed Arcana was written by Gary. So some people might let that slip in, some people might not. But the one that really was a big deal was they said, nope, none of this stuff. Holmes Basic, okay, or Moldvay Basic, which is the one I started with. Or any of the derivatives that came after those, the Beckme set, Rule Cyclopedia, they're like, no, that's kiddie D&D. And so we're not going to discuss that here. And so they split off into their own message board called the Knights and Knaves Ale House. Okay, so that one gets very, very specific. And they're very, I'm just going to say, passionate about what they will and won't allow you to talk about on there. So, but in any event, you had people talking about these old games, and it got to the point where then, again, you had Castles and Crusades out there. You had Necromancer games and Troll Lord games making these, you know, newer games, but with the old school feel. And so then what's going to happen is we're going to jump to 2006 because this is sort of a key milestone point. So because Troll Lord Games published Castles and Crusades using the open game license, that was a big part of this game. You know what? I could be wrong. Maybe it's not published with the open game license. I could have sworn that it was. It's got it. Yeah, there it was. I knew it was. Okay, so there's the open game license that they put in there. So because this game was created using the open game license, but to create a completely different game, not to create content for the existing game, but creating a new game, this starts to open up the floodgates of how people think the OGL can be used. Because the original intent, and again, this is coming from the person that I worked with at Wizards of the Coast when I worked on their business, what she told me was that their thought was adventures don't make money. Rule books make money. This is the stuff that makes money, okay? Because it's a big book and everyone's going to buy it if you need to play. If you publish an adventure, you've immediately cut what your potential audience is, because the only people who are going to buy those are going to be dungeon masters. Okay, so that's a small subset of the universe of people that are going to play your game. And then on top of that, the margins are going to be smaller because it's a thinner book, it's smaller, it's paperback instead of hardback, so people won't pay as much for that. But you still have to go through the effort of writing and art direction and layout, so you're still putting money into that. But again, your margins are going to be smaller. So they were hoping that other people would come around and publish all the stuff that they didn't want to, so that they could focus on these big chunky rule books that were going to like make them the most margins. Okay. But what happened was very quickly people started to figure out, well, we can write adventures, sure, and we can do supplements. And that's where you get this explosion of like class guides for fighters and barbarians and brand new classes and brand new feats and brand new spells and all that kind of like supplementary material. And a lot of it was very creative. A lot of it was also not great, not well tested, not balanced, whatever. But there was a lot of that. But then you have people that realize we can write our own game with this. And I don't know that that was ever something that anybody kind of thought was going to happen. So in 2006, you have a gentleman by the name of, I think it's Chris. I wrote his name down in here. And of course I can't. There it is. Chris Gonerman. Okay, so he had been running a 2E game, second edition, but he'd started playing with Moldvay Basic. I showed you that set earlier. So he started with this, okay? And when he finished his second edition game, he's like, I want to go back to my roots. I want to start with Moldvay Basic. Sorry for the noise, but my boxes just slipped there. So he decided that he was going to use the open game license to write a version of Moldvay BX, but a new one. Because again, at the time, this on the secondary market was starting to get very, very expensive, and there just weren't a lot of them out there, so you couldn't really find it everywhere. So he created a game called Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game. So this is sort of the first OSR game. Now, there are people that will quibble and say that this one was first. They were designed very much kind of roughly at the same time. My understanding is that Chris Gonerman began working on Basic Fantasy Role-Playing way before, but it got published later, and this ended up being published first. However, I've also read that this started being worked on at least 2 to 3 years before it was published. So you can quibble. I'm not going to put a stake in the ground because I don't know. All right. But what I do know is that Basic Fantasy Role-Playing, a lot of people will say that it was the first OSR style game. Now, what this game does is tries to recreate the mechanics of Moldvay BX, but not 100% faithfully, because there was this thought that they could do it exactly the way it was, because that would open them up to legal issues. People were very gun shy while they were doing this, because TSR was very suit happy. They would go after people all the time. If you even made like a campaign website that you just talked about your campaign, but it included D&D mechanics, TSR would come after you with a cease and desist, and they usually won every time because they were a big company and people couldn't afford lawyers. So there was this thought that, well, if we change enough that it's not exactly replicating the original game, then they can't say that we copied them. So there are things in basic fantasy role playing, like the separation of race as class. If you've seen my video on race as class, that was this version of the game. But people were so used to separating those two concepts by now that basic fantasy role playing separates them. And it has, just some other things that are a little bit different about the game. So that's kind of like the main one that sticks out. But like there are little tweaks here and there where it's not 100% faithful. Okay. But this is the start of what a lot of people would call like the retro clones. Okay, so that's a term that gets used a lot in discussing OSR style games. So basic fantasy role playing, one of the things that was really helped it along was the fact that you can get the basic rules for free as a PDF, and the print rules, it's sort of like a POD, and you get it at cost. It's like $5 or something on that. At least it was like a few years ago. I don't know if that's still how much it is, but the intent was to try to create a system that people could use to play these old school adventures that they still had, or create a community around this style of game. Now, roughly at the same time, I kind of just mentioned this, there is this game. This is the Old School Reference and Index Compilation, or OSRIC. Okay, and you see it says first edition adventure games. So this is intended to replicate this. Okay, so it was begun by a former lawyer. So he was an attorney, Matt Finch, and he, because of his background as an attorney, he really understood the ins and outs of like what can and can't be copyrighted. And this idea that like you can't copyright game mechanics, you can only copyright the expression of those game mechanics. And you can copyright product identity, but the mechanics themselves are not something that you can copyright. So he kind of knew his ins and outs and his ways around that. So he kind of began this idea, but then he handed it off to a guy by the name of Stuart Marshall. Okay, and he's kind of the main guy behind OSRIC. So Matt Finch doesn't really take credit for this because Stuart Marshall's the guy that kind of like really put it together. All right, so this is all the spells, the monsters, the magic items. Now, this is a later edition. The first edition of this game, or first printing, I should say, wasn't anywhere near this long. This is a more complete one that has everything: all the monsters, all the spells, all the DM advice, and the all the classes and stuff. Okay, but this one also does things a little bit differently, and like the experience point progression is different than what you find in advanced D&D. Okay, for every class the experience points are just slightly off, like fighters at 1900 instead of 2000. And again, that was done deliberately because they were afraid of exactly replicating this. They wanted to do it a little bit differently. This also has a combination of, you can choose either ascending or descending armor class, at least I think. But there are changes in here that are made that are slight, but they're done very deliberately to make sure that they were protected legally and could say like, oh, well, we didn't copy it, we kind of just did our own version of the game. So it's splitting hairs, but again, Matt Finch was a lawyer, so I think he knew that like that should be enough. Okay, so and what's happening though, very interesting, is that you start to have these games coming out, and Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro aren't suing anybody. They aren't telling anybody you can't do that. The only time they do that is if you use their product identity when they specifically said that you can't. And in this systems reference document, it basically says, if it's not in here, you can't use it. So as an example, beholders, mind flayers, things like that, or proper names of spells like Mordenkainen's Faithful Hand, it's not in there because those are product identity of Wizards of the Coast, and so you can't use those. But as long as you follow that, you can use anything in the SRD and kind of do anything you want with it. Okay, so that's OSRIC. Now, 2007, you're also going to see the release of a game called Labyrinth Lore. So Daniel Proctor starts talking about this on the message boards in 2007 and saying, I want to publish a game that is, again, interestingly enough, going to be based on this. So now you have a second game based on that version of the game. And I'm guessing, Daniel Proctor, probably similar to Chris Gonerman, maybe started playing with that edition. But it's interesting that in the history of D&D editions, that one's probably the shortest because it only lasted for 2 years. It debuted in 81, and by 83 it had already been replaced by the Menser Basic set, from Beckme. So a, a game that was only out there for 2 years ends up already within like a year's time spawning two different, quote unquote retro clones. And now again, Labyrinth Lord makes deliberate changes to the rules. So as I recall, I did use this system before. I ran some old modules, some old TSR-era adventures for my players, and I used Labyrinth Lord for that because I didn't want to get out and use my old box set because, as you see, it's getting a little worn, and I'm trying to be careful with it. But I think if memory serves, it uses a 20 level base for every class, whereas this game, the classes go to 14. And then it has a bunch of different changes in it, but 90% of it is something that reverse engineered was this game. And he did it for that reason, because he wanted people to be able to play a system that was very much like this. Now, what happens is, because then you have two games that are basically based on this edition, this starts to become sort of the most popular choice for creating OSR content using this version of the game as the base. Now, Basic Fantasy Role Playing is still published. Labyrinth Lord kind of went on hiatus for a while, but I think, memory serves, I think it's either just recently done or will be coming out with a Kickstarter soon. But eventually it's going to get replaced with this game, and I'll get there in a second. Old School Essentials. But again, yet a third game based on the BX engine. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why, and this is the one that I use. And when I create content, I create it for this. And it's because, it's because what I started with, but it's just interesting that there is a huge creative push in the OSR community behind creating content for this particular edition of the game. And again, it's interesting that happened, considering the short shelf life of this game. All right. Now, the fourth one that kind of comes out, and there are way more than this, but I'd say these are sort of like the big four at the time, at the dawn of the OSR. So you've got Basic Fantasy Role Playing, you have Osric, you have Labyrinth Lord, and then the fourth one's going to be Swords and Wizardry. Now, this is also by Matt Finch, so the lawyer guy I told you that kind of started Osric. So he decides to create a version of a retro clone and reverse engineers original D&D. Okay, the box set, the white box. Okay, and what he does, the original conception of it was this, plus some elements, like these 3 books, plus some elements from Supplement 1 Greyhawk. Okay, which is again where the Thief class debuts. So that's really a big thing he's pulling from that. Okay, so that's Swords and Wizardry, but then that spawns this whole own thing of a bunch of different variations. So there's one that's just the 3 Little Brown books without Greyhawk, so no Thief class. Then there's the core rules, which do have the stuff from Greyhawk. Then there's another version that has all of the supplements, at least up through 3. So Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry. So that's going to be your, in addition to your thieves and paladins, you're going to get half elves and monks and assassins and druids. Okay, so that's going to come in that version again. Then there's another one that's like a light version. It's like completely stripped down. It's crazy how many variations of Swords and Wizardry there are. Now, that's another one that just recently had a massive Kickstarter for a new edition of the game. All right, so these things are kind of still out there. And at this point, they're coming up on 20 years old. Not quite, but you're getting there. Okay, so you have all these different games that came out. And because they were all tied to rules systems, this is the confusion where I think a lot of people believe that old school gaming is playing old games, old editions. And that's part of it, but that's way too simplistic of a definition. because it's really more about the attitude and the style of gaming that you're trying to evoke as opposed to the specific rules. So another thing that happens that people get confused about is they say, "Oh, it's playing old school gaming is playing rules light editions of D&D." Now, you've heard me talk about this before. This is anything but rules light. This is very complicated. The rules are arcane. They're complex. Gary Gygax specifically created these rules in order to have an answer to any question that might come up, especially at a tournament style game, so that his judges, his referees could judge everybody from the same standpoint. So he didn't want to have holes where people had to make judgment calls. He wanted there to be a rule for everything kind of thing. Now, it's impossible to do that anyway, but that was sort of the intent behind advanced D&D, one of its guiding principles. Okay, so in order to explain this, then what happens is in 2008, Matt Finch writes this document called A Primer for Old School Games. And in it, he outlines 4 different principles of playing old school style games. And the first one is rulings, not rules. So that's directly against advanced D&D. So the idea is that you don't have a rule for everything, and you trust in your referee or your DM or your judge or whatever you want to call that person. You trust them to create a fair ruling based on the circumstances that have come up, and then to apply that ruling going forward in the future, so you're not always changing your mind. Okay, so that everybody's on the same page. So that's the first step. And I would say if you're interested in old school gaming at all, you can just download the primer for free. You can find it. Just search for old school primer for old school gaming, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But like, it's just very easy to find, and I would highly recommend reading it because it will help explain what this style of game is. But the second part is player skill, not character ability. So you've heard me talk about this before, and that was one of the things why the people that didn't like the addition of non-weapon proficiencies and skills to the game. That's one of the things that they don't like about it, is because once you start adding that, you're less relying on your ability as a player to explain what it is that you want to do, and instead you start looking at your sheet and rolling on numbers and saying, I'm making a search check, instead of I'm going to search the room over there and I'm going to turn this upside down and look underneath and see if I find anything. Okay, so it completely changes the way the game is played once you start adding those, because again, you're starting to remove the narrative and rely on dice rolls. And then the other thing it does is that once you start having those skills listed, it then begins to limit what you think your character can do, because if you didn't take a specific skill, then the thought is, well, then I can't try that thing because I don't have that skill. Okay, so that was a big part of it. The other part was that it's heroic, but it's not super heroic. Okay, and that's a big complaint that people have about like 5e, but it's really any kind of D&D 3rd edition on. It changes the style of the game. So 3rd edition, when it came out, they talked about, getting back to the gaming and getting back in the dungeon, but they start to talk about not focusing on things that this game or 1st edition or whatever were all about. Resource management is a huge part of that, because it's a game, and part of the game was managing your resources and the tension and the anxiety that you would feel when those resources started to come low. Or maybe you picked the wrong ones. And I've talked about this all in my video on the D&D magic system. But picking which spells that you were going to prepare for that day's adventure, that was part of your resource management. Using the information that you had at hand to know what spells would be the most likely use of you on that day, and then saving it to cast it at the right moment when it was going to have the most impact. Okay, so but 3rd edition was like, no, those aren't things we're going to really worry about as much anymore. That's not a thing. That people don't have fun tracking how many arrows they have or how much food they have left, or like whatever. And that's fine if you don't like that, but it is kind of a hallmark of these old style games. So, the idea of being an adventurer and then becoming a hero, it was kind of like this hero's journey, where starting with 3rd edition, the idea starts to be that you start out already as a superhero, and then you're just going to get better. All right. And then the last one was game balance. And this one really is, the idea is that earlier editions of the game, there was no CR system, challenge rating system. There was none of that kind of thing. So if you didn't listen to the clues, you might turn down a corridor at first level and end up facing a lich or something like that because you weren't paying attention to what was going on. And so the old style of games embrace that and say, like, that is part of it, that there is no game balance. Later on, some other folks wrote sort of a revised version of the primer for old school games. It's called Principia Apocrypha, or Principia, I think, in Italian. I don't know. I know it doesn't matter. But it expands on it a little bit. Ben Milton, one of the guys behind Questing Beasts, or the guy behind Questing Beasts, is one of the authors. Just a few other folks on that one. I think you can just read the original primer and it's fine. But if you want a little bit more detail, you could check that one out. But the idea is that it's trying to explain that it's really more about, again, that vibe or the style of game that you're playing and how you approach the game than it is the nitty-gritty mechanics. Now, having the mechanics helps because mechanics of a game do help kind of define how you should be playing that game, which is why something like this with skills and feats and all those combinations of, like, class abilities and racial abilities and feats and all that kind of stuff, this changes how you play the game because it starts to become more about building that optimal character and, building a character. And it's not a term that we used back in the old days because you didn't build it, you rolled it up and then you went adventuring. And it took you like 5 minutes to create a character. So the rules do impact the style of game that you're going to end up playing because they're designed for that very reason, to create a certain style. So that said, though, you can play other editions of the game besides original D&D or AD&D or BX or whatever, in an old school style. And we're going to talk a little bit about how in a second here, okay? But I do want to talk about, just very, very briefly, 5th edition, okay? So 5th edition comes out in 2014. Now remember, if you're doing your timing, okay? So people start creating these ideas of, like, can we use the OGL to recreate older editions of D&D? And that conversations is starting in the very, very early 2000s, like the aughts, like 2003, 2004. And then you do have those Retroclones coming out starting in like 2006, 2007. Okay. 2008, Wizards of the Coast switches from 3rd edition or from 3.5 edition to 4th edition. And we're not going to talk about 4th edition right now, other than to say that, like, it was very polarizing in the community, and that was I was directly responsible for the creation of the Pathfinder role-playing game, which is a continuation of 3.5. A lot of people would call it 3.75. Okay, but that was a response to this shift to 4th edition that was so very different from every edition of D&D that had come before. But you have this growing community of people, okay, who were being very vocal about the principles and the ideas and, like, the pros of playing older editions of D&D. Okay, so 4th edition only lasts from 2008 into 2000. Well, already by 2012, they were talking about, we're going to make a new edition. So that's when we started hearing about what was called D&D Next. So only 4 years into the 4E time period. So this is published in 2014. Now, what's interesting about this is that one of the design principles that they were trying to do with this was to kind of dial back all this stuff that they had changed in 3rd and 4th edition and try to get it back a little bit closer to the original editions of D&D. Now, whether you think that it succeeded at that or not, I don't want to say it's not relevant. It is relevant because, it impacts if you want to play this game. But it was one of the design principles behind this game. And in order to do that, they brought in old school people that by this point had shifted off of the message boards, or maybe they hadn't shifted completely, but you had these communities developing. The main one was called Google Plus, which was like Google's answer, I guess, to Facebook. It is unfortunately gone now, but for a short, skinny minute of time, it was like the prime area of content creators for old school D&D that would get on there and share all these ideas. And then Google Plus created this idea of community. It was called a community thing, where you could kind of create and curate your own group that talked about these topics. And so I was on Google Plus back at the time. I started my blog in 2011, and like everyone that had a blog back then was on Google Plus, or an old school blog, and people would go on there and just freely offering ideas of things. Okay, and some of the people got very, very popular with their ideas, and a few of them ended up consulting on this edition of the game. So those people like had an intent or an interest in helping make this game play more like an old school game. And that's why you can take this game and apply something like 5e hardcore mode or 5 torches deep, things like that take 5th edition and strip out some of the stuff like feats, which are optional, by the way. A lot of people don't remember that, but feats are optional. But you can get rid of a lot of the baggage that's in here and play an old school style game that is based more on those principles from that primer of the old school gaming. Rulings, not rules, and player skill, not character ability, like all that kind of stuff. Okay. The other thing that this does, 5th edition, again, they were trying to dial back the excesses that happened in 3rd and 4th edition. So there is a design principle in this game called bounded accuracy. And I'm not going to explain it very well right now, but the short version is like in a 3.5 game or a Pathfinder game, you will have a character go into battle or whatever, go into combat and say like, okay, I'm plus 42 to hit. And then my damage is and it's insane. And it just keeps scaling up and up and up and up. And if you take the right mixture of things, you could be like plus 30 to hit at like 5th level or something like that. It's the amount of power creep in those games, and it's designed for that. It's specifically designed for you, because that's why there were so many splat books with all these new prestige classes and different feats and all these different things that you could combine together to create a character that is really good at doing like a specific thing, and then that just becomes the only thing that you do. Well, this edition was designed to really kind of pull that back, which is why your bonuses to do things top out at 5. And a lot of people don't like that, but that was done very deliberately to help kind of rein in that power creep. Now, there are other things that you could do here to go beyond the 5, of course. 5 is your proficiency bonus, I think, but then you add your ability bonus, and then you've got some magic items, things like that. So you can get up past 5, but you're not going to be like plus 45, okay, like you were in a 3.5 game. All right, so and that was done deliberately, and I think because they knew that like people, a certain type of gamer wasn't necessarily really into that anymore. Now, some people are, which is why they moved to Pathfinder and they've stuck with it, and they like that ability to customize and create characters like that. And I was one of those. Well, I didn't like to do that as much because I'm just not good at it, but I liked Pathfinder. So but that's where I think that there's this sort of connective tissue between the OSR and 5th edition that a lot of people either aren't aware of or they like to dismiss it, but it is there. And again, I don't necessarily know that it was executed properly, but I do think that they had good intentions of it. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, for the rest of the video, what I want to do is talk about some games and things that I have and kind of show you like what's cool about them, why I like them. I'm not going to review these. I'm just going to kind of show them briefly to give you a sense of like what's out there and the breadth of what is considered maybe an old school game, and why that definition then starts to, I don't want to say it becomes meaningless. It just becomes very hard to sort of categorize things because it is so broad. So old school essentials, you guys know this is the game that I run for my daughter. I always say that I run BX. I always tell people that I'm running this because I am. Okay. but I use this because I don't want to bring this and have my daughter and her friends get their grubby pizza hands all over this or spill a soda on it or something like that. So I refer to this, when I'm planning my sessions and stuff like that. But at the table, we use this. So they call it a retro adventure game. But this is 100% a recreation of the rules from this. So I talked about how like Labyrinth Lord and Basic Fantasy Roleplay tweak some stuff so that it's not exactly the same. This is exactly the same. The only small differences that are in here are when there were discrepancies in this game between the basic rulebook, which covers levels 1 through 3, and then the expert rulebook, which covers levels 4 through 14. Okay, every once in a while there was a small discrepancy in how a rule was implemented, and so when Gavin Norman, who is the author of Old School Essentials, when he was putting it together, he had to make a judgment call on which rule was more consistent over time, and that's the only time where you might find something that doesn't match, but it'll match in one of those books. It just won't necessarily match in both. Okay, but this is a fun one because it's a box set, and it has all these different books in here. So I've taken out a couple of my books. Now I don't remember where I put them. I guess they're here. Here we are. Okay, so here's the classic fantasy genre rules. And then I think the core rules. So here's the core rules. All right, so this is the rules for the game. And now the reason people like this so much, a lot of different reasons. Okay, the art is really fun. It's very reminiscent of old school art. But this layout, like they utilize the end papers, and these are the tables that you're going to need most often during this game. Okay, I love the dungeon sequence per dungeon turn, and it tells you exactly the procedure for how to do it, the procedure for wilderness exploration, which is something a lot of people don't think about. But this game is very procedural, and that's a feature. I love it. Same thing with combat, the order of combat in here and how it works. Encounter sequence, surprise, and then determine encounter distance, initiative, actions, conclusion. Okay, so all that kind of stuff that you would need. And then these are the core rules. Running the game, monsters. It's not the actual monsters, it's just telling you how to read the monster notations, like the game stats and what all those things mean. A brief explanation of how magic works, combat, encounters, evasion and pursuit, hazards, challenges, time, alignment, ability scores, creating a character. Okay, so that's all in the core rules. Okay, and then you have the genre rules. This is classic fantasy, so these are the rules that you would use to recreate Moldvay, like as far as the characters. So this has got your different 7 different classes: cleric, dwarf, elf, fighter, halfling, magic user, and thief. Okay, and then it's got your languages, your equipment that would be common in a fantasy game, vehicles and mounts, water vessels, hirelings. And again, the layout in here, this was one of the first published games to do this and get a lot of attention. So as an example, here's the elf class. It's hard to fit into the screen here. Everything that you need is here. There's no page flipping. So you play an elf, you just have that page, and then the next page is the fighter. Okay, every single rule, whatever it is in here is done on a 2-page spread to eliminate flipping. Okay, so your equipment is a 2-page spread. Weapons and armor, a 2-page spread. Weapon quality is stuck right there. So it's laid out to prevent you from having to find where things are. It's brilliant. And the fact that people don't do that anymore, like if you look at the 5e book, and granted this was published a few years before, but just something as simple as, like, I forget which class it was. I want to say fighter. There's one of the classes in here where it spills over by like one word onto the next page. I mean, it's ridiculous that they did it that way. Maybe it wasn't fighter, but there's things in here where the layout decisions are mind-boggling why they would have been done that way. And Old School Essentials gets rid of that, and it fixes that problem. So anyway, it's got spells for clerics and magic users. It's got my books are all mixed up. Monsters, okay, and then it has treasures, classic fantasy treasures. And this is the classic fantasy monsters, by the way. Okay. So it has that. Then what they did, which is another brilliant idea, was they published this expansion called Advanced Fantasy. Okay, so obviously this is an homage to the first edition Player's Handbook cover. You can see this idol with the gems, and this guy's trying to go up there to get the gem. Okay, there's some creatures down here that's been killed, you know. So again, homage cover. But what this does is it takes the classes, the different races, the spells, and the monsters and the treasures from advanced D&D and recreates them mechanically to be compatible with Moldvay basic Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so which is how we played back in the day. I think I've mentioned this before, but we didn't really kind of grasp that the rules engine behind advanced D&D was different than basic. We thought it was just extra stuff. We didn't realize it was intended to be a completely different game until way later. And part of that's just because we were lazy and didn't read the rules. We just wanted to start playing. So you saw that there was a paladin class, and you didn't look to see that it operated differently. You were just like, I'm going to play a paladin, but in this version of the game. And so what these books do is they allow you to do that, but rewriting the rules to make it consistent so that you're not technically playing two different rule systems. I thought that was just such a smart idea. I was so excited to get these books and then use them in my daughter's game. So that's Old School Essentials. And again, you see part of the benefit of that is the kind of the layout. Okay, so we've talked about Retroclones. Now, what I want to talk about are games that are sort of like in the spirit of old school gaming, but don't replicate a specific old school system. So even something as popular as like Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is really fun. I only have as a PDF, but it's not creating a specific edition, or it's not trying to recreate a specific edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It's its own system that is an homage, and it has very much in common with it, but it has enough different that it's kind of its own thing. So a lot people definitely, that is an old school game, but it's definitely not a retro clone. It's kind of living in its own world. So I think again, it was that OSR Simulacrum blog. I think he called it OSR adjacent. Okay, so something like that, or Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, which I think has just been renamed Hyperborea, which I guess is fine. I don't find it as evocative, but that is more in the vein of like first edition advanced D&D, but I think it has enough changes that it's kind of like its own thing. Okay, and there's just a ton of them out there. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list. It's just to kind of let you understand the breadth and the depth of this movement so that you can kind of discover the types of games that you like. All right. Then you have games that go even farther afield and do their own thing, but are created in an old school environment, or they are intended to be played as old school games, but mechanically have nothing or very little in common with first edition Dungeons and Dragons or original Dungeons and Dragons or Moldvay BX, whatever. So let's just talk about Knave. This one just came out. Knave second edition. So this is by the Questing Beast guy. This is by Ben Milton. Okay. And he's a huge proponent of that, like layout, like he calls it control panel, but like the 2-page spreads. So again, he's utilizing the end pages, which is again, why more people don't do this. I mean, I'm guessing it probably costs more on the printing side, and that might be why. But having the things that you're going to refer to all the time here, as opposed to having to look it up in here, I think is really cool. Okay, so this is a game. You can play this as its own game. Now, I didn't buy it to play the system. I bought it because it has all these really cool tables in here, all these cool random tables that I am just going to pick up and use in the game that I run for my daughter, my Old School Essentials game. But it has really fun ideas in here. But this has like the standard 6 ability scores from D&D. Okay, but they're ranked from 0 to 10, not 3 to 18. And everybody in here is a knave. There are no character classes. That's why the game's called Knave. So anybody can learn magic, anybody can fight, anybody can do thieving stuff, depending on how you build your character. Okay, it's not a skill-based game, though. Again, it's that old school style of game, but you have careers that will give you like some like equipment and stuff like that, and it kind of gives you a sense of like how you would play that character. It has this little spell builder thing where it's sort of like it's done, instead of having a list of spells, it's all these tables, and you roll on the tables, and that allows you to put your spells together. So I'm trying to find the section in here, but it's done sort of like a it's not quite like verb noun or whatever, but it is very much in that style of like you get a sense from rolling like what your spell's gonna do. So you have elements, effects, forms, qualities, and you roll to figure out your spell formula, and then you use these tables. Well, that's your wizard name tables, but then you use like, here's your qualities, here's your effects, here's your elements, here's your forms, and you roll to combine those, and then that tells you what the spell does, and then he describes later on like each of these things, so you kind of get a sense of how to do it, but all in this very small thin little book. So this is great for old school style play without playing an old school game. Okay, so this is what a lot of people would call this new SR, like new school Renaissance or new school role playing, however you want to describe it. But it's newer games that use the old school aesthetic, but to create new mechanics. Okay, so index card RPG is another one. So this one kind of straddles the line, getting a little farther away, but it has character classes, and it has ability scores and like all that kind of stuff that you're used to in D&D. It just handles it differently, but you can take stuff from this and use it in an old school game pretty easily. So this is a really fun game with really great ideas, okay, and incorporates some stuff from 5th edition, some stuff from earlier games, which is honestly how I play Molva. I don't play this rules as written, okay, I kind of do my own thing. So then you have my understanding is this is pronounced Mirkbori, not Morkborg, even though that's what it looks like. But again, you're utilizing these end papers. Now, why do I keep harping on that? Because again, a lot of, once you get out of things that are completely replicating old school, like original rules, Labyrinth Lord, Osric, things like that. I talked about this earlier, but there is a subset of people in the old school community that are very interested in the design aspect. Okay. And that is a huge part of the popularity and the appeal of some of these games. So I want to talk about that briefly. Now, there are some in the old school community who sort of deride this kind of stuff. They don't like it because they say it's more about style over substance, and that it really doesn't evoke the old school feel. I don't really agree with that. I think there's place for both. But I do think that things like this that sort of show the different kinds of things that you can do to evoke old school feel, but with like new layout and things like that, can bring in gamers who are used to or want to see that kind of thing, rather than just, the similar old, 2-column, boring, not boring, but like utilitarian, I guess is a better word, layout. Now, some people say they the derogatory term for this is art punk. I wouldn't think that should be derogatory. Punk is awesome. So, this is neat. Now, again, I bought this game with no intention of ever playing this game as written. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean I don't like it. But I bought this and I used tons of stuff from this in the game that I run for my daughter, because, again, I want my game to have a little bit more of sort of like that grimdark aesthetic to it, that grimdark feel that you don't necessarily get rules as written from, old school essentials. I can't fit everything in here. Okay. So, and this helps me with that. It gives me ideas, even if it's just a picture or something where I go like, oh, I should put something like that in the game. But also some of the random tables and things that are in here are, again, useful in any kind of stuff. So I'm super happy with this purchase, even though, I've never run it as written. Okay. So that's that one. Now we're getting a little bit farther afield, but again, I think still in the spirit of an old school game. So this is, a rules light star and sorcery role-playing game with an old school spirit. I just said that, so that's funny. So this is Solar Blades and Cosmic Spells. Now, this is sort of a companion game to another game by the same author. This is Diogo Nogueira. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name incorrectly. Another game that he did called Sharp Swords and something spells. Sinister Spells. It might be Sharp Swords. I wish I'd written the name. I don't have that one. I have this one, and I got this based on a review that I saw. It's either on Questing Beast or Dungeon Craft. But I bought this again, not thinking that I would play it, but I love post-apocalyptic games. And there's sections in here of post-apocalyptic stuff. But again, these tables are just so evocative. Deed to recharge your solar blade, which is your lightsaber, like what you might have to do that. And then as you just get further and further in here, there's just some really, really interesting creative tables to help explain the way that the rules work in this book. I also love the art too, but things like psychic backlash, what might happen, and then you roll, and then the character's mind is not focused, and the next time someone can resist one of their psychic powers, they receive a positive die to do so. So it's adding a mechanical element to some kind of cool imagery stuff and narrative things that are going to happen when you have psychic backlash, or your sorcery corruption. Strange and terrible symbols of the void appear on the character's body in a place that they can hide. But as you get worse and worse, there's things that get worse and worse. So that's the kind of stuff that there's tables in this, even though this is a science fiction game, you could use in a fantasy game. And I have done so. I have taken ideas from this again and used it in my daughter's game. So really fun game. All right, now I'm going to get into supplements. And this is where I feel like the old school movement shines more so than rule sets or complete games, but the supplements that are being written and designed, I think, are brilliant. And they're also just fun to read, and they're very inspirational to give you ideas, and they're fun to look at. Okay, so this is just an example, Into the Cess and Citadel. I briefly mentioned this before, but this is a book about running city campaigns, and it's actually system neutral. So there are there's no rule systems to back this up, but one of the things that it does, and I love it, is this section here, system neutral and what it means. And then it tells you how to interpret things that you're going to read in this book and apply it to the game that you're playing. So what is a turn? What is a round? What is advantage? What is disadvantage? So when you see advantage, disadvantage, you might be thinking this is 5e. It's not. It's just, that is a very elegant and unique mechanic. Not unique, but it's an elegant mechanic for solving so many, should that be a +2 or a +4? Should it be a -1 or whatever? So I use advantage and disadvantage in my daughter's game. I know a lot of people will probably quibble at that and think that that's a poor choice. It works so well, and it helps me not have to think about what should the plus or minus be and just do it that way. And it works really, really well. It's not that hard to come up with a plus or minus. It's just easier. Plus it's more fun. They have the players, my daughter's game, they love rolling 2 dice and seeing what happens. And that look on their face when, they have disadvantage, and then they roll a natural 20, but then they also roll a 3, and they're so frustrated. So anyway, but it talks about how to save versus what it means, and how to interpret saving throws. And so it almost starts to kind of create its own system without meaning to, but that's it. Just one page on how to convert this stuff so that you can use this with the game of your choice. Probably is going to be most convenient with a class and level system, but you could use this with Knave very easily, which has no classes. Okay. But again, the design, the art, it's got the book ribbon in here. Maybe it has more than one. It's got 2. It's got 2 book ribbons. Now, they didn't use the end papers for things, but encounters and reputation and just all this kind of stuff, and just the art. And again, using this black and pink, I thought was a very fun choice, because it's not something that you see in other books. People don't typically use that color combination. It's out there, but it's not common. All right. But then different chapters have different colors to them, which again is something I really appreciate. But cultists, people, and places and things like that. Okay. So again, I'm just showing you sort of the design elements of these books and why it makes them so much fun to use, that you want to read this and you want to use it in your games. And this is the kind of stuff that you're not seeing come out from corporate companies. You're not going to ever see a book like this by Wizards of the Coast. They just wouldn't. It's too out there, which is a weird thing to say. Okay, but I find it much more inspirational. Okay, this is Knock Magazine. I have talked about this before as well. So this is coming out of, I think, France. So this is the first issue, but they do unique things like there's a whole little adventure here on the book jacket. Okay, now I did a whole review of this, or at least a partial review when I was covering some other things. But I love Knock Magazine. They're up to 4 issues now, and it's just full of all kinds of stuff. And just, again, look at the layout and the design here, which is probably a blast to put together with figuring out like the typefaces and the, like, look at this. Like, it's just so cool. But it's also useful. Now, this one's a little bit less useful because it is a little bit harder to read, but that's okay. Because I appreciate having, like, I appreciate the fact that they made those kinds of choices. I thought it was really brave, and it is fun. It is so much fun to look at that it makes me want to read it. And I don't get that kind of like glazed eyes over when I'm just reading like page after page after page of text. So much fun. Okay. Now, I have definitely done a whole review of this, Veins of the Earth. But again, I'm just wanting to show the creativity within the old school community and the kinds of stuff that's coming out. This book is just see my review. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. Now, this is an adventure for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. So that is another big influential system. It's not quite a Retroclone because it makes a few changes, but it did come up with this very unique concept. Well, a few. It is based on the BX engine. So this one, again, told you this was popular. Okay, but then it does things like there's no thief class. Is it called an expert? I'm forgetting the name of the class. But basically, it changes all of the thief skills, which in here are done on a percentage basis, except for hear noise, which is based on an X and 6 chance. Everything else is percentage based. It changes all of the skills to X and 6, and it has more of them, and it lets you choose which ones you want to have and how many points you're going to put into those as you advance in level, which is very elegant solution to a problem a lot of people complain about, which is like all thieves are the same because they all scale their abilities at the same level. But that one allows you to do, like, it has different abilities. It also had a very unique way of handling encumbrance through it's called slot encumbrance, and they were, I think, if not the first, they were at least one of the first games to do that, come up with this concept that like how much you carry is determined by these slots, and you fill in your slots. And once those are full, then you're at full encumbrance. And so that helps you prevent things like from forgetting that you're accidentally carrying 4 swords because, you didn't cross off your sheet or like whatever. So this is an adventure for that. This is also created for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Okay. And that's a game I've never played. It, but I use concepts from it all the time in the game that I'm running for my daughter. I know I mentioned that a lot, but I'm trying to show you that you can get ideas from anywhere and be inspired from anywhere. And I'm a huge proponent of that. So Scenic Dunsmith, this is such a fun adventure, and it's replayable. And I don't want to spoil it if you're going to play it. But one of the things that it allows you to do is there's these different families in the town that are determined based on cards. Okay, so each family has a different suit, and the different numbers of the cards tell you who that person is. And then as you create the town, and that's the kind of the most brilliant, well, not the most brilliant, but one of the coolest things in here that I'd never seen before is this town generation system. Okay, of a setup where you're dropping dice on a paper, okay, and then depending on where the dice land, and there's the different kinds of dice and what numbers they are, that's telling you what buildings are located where. Okay, so you're rolling a 10, you're rolling 10 d6s, 1 d8, 1 d4, and 2 different colored d12s. And then you're marking the location of the D4. That's the time cube. And then the die furthest from the D4 is the location of one of the characters in here. And then the location that's one of the D8s is a church, and it can already be marked as a location. Like, I had never seen anything like this. When I bought this adventure, I was like, holy cow, that is so interesting and such a fun way to create a town. And because it's done that way, and because you never know who's going to be in that town, where they're going to be, that's what makes this replayable. Okay, so again, a design element, or not mechanics so much as design choices that you're not seeing in stuff, again, being published by the corporate companies. Now, this is yet again another Lamentations game. They do a lot of creative stuff. That's just, it is what it is. And I reviewed this, and this was the first thing this was the first video I ever published for this channel. It was a review of this. Now this is an adventure, but this is the box set. It's like a bigger adventure. And the thing you hear rolling around there's like custom dice in here. But the first video I ever made was for this game, written by my friend Kelvin Green. Okay. Yeah, he's an artist and a designer. So those are just some of the examples of the things you're going to see coming out of the old school community, and why I think it caught on the way that it did, and why it diverged so quickly, because people kept pushing the envelope of the kinds of content that you could publish. So again, this isn't even created for a specific system. It doesn't say on here anywhere that this is old school, but it's definitely old school in the feel as you're reading this, as like how you would use it. It's I would call this old school, but it's old school in that sort of, I guess, if you want to use the term art punk, and again, I wouldn't use that derogatorily, it is different in presentation than something a little bit more straightforward that we've looked at before. So that's just sort of my brief overview. If there's any of this stuff that you want to see me do a full review on, now again, I have done Knock, and I've done Veins of the Earth, and then I've done Big Tear in the Streets. But I haven't really done any of these other ones. So if there's any of these other games or, supplements or anything like that you want to see me do a review of, leave a comment below and let me know. Let me know what your favorite old school games are. Let me know if you would even entertain looking at an old school publication or game or supplement. Maybe you're a 5e player and you're 5e all the way, and this doesn't appeal to you. That's fine, but let me know why. What is it about it that you don't like? Or maybe you've never tried an old school game before, but now you see this and you're interested and want to learn more. Let me know that too. I just kind of, I want to have a conversation with you and talk about this movement, because it is something I'm pretty passionate about. Okay, and while you're also down in the comments, you can find places where you can join me on social media. So they're all listed in the show notes, and you'll find where you can find my blog. And don't forget, please, that I do have my Superfans open. So if you are able to and can help contribute to the growth of my channel and helping me over time to upgrade my equipment, I am in a little bit of a interesting situation right now. So I'm being extremely conservative with my finances. You all know, I think you should know by now, I own a boutique ad agency, and I'm kind of in this situation where I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to have this main client that I have right now. And so because of that, I'm trying to hold on to stuff. So, but over time, I am going to try to upgrade my equipment. And so your Superfans, thanks. If you can contribute, is a huge help towards that in the future. So that's going to be it for this particular video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I think you can probably tell just by the way I'm talking about it that this is a subject I'm pretty, like I said, I'm passionate about. And I do hope that I helped connect some dots for you about the OSR and explain kind of how I think it is. And that's it. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I put my notes together for this video. So I randomly today just came across a Instagram post by Brian Baumgartner, who's the guy who played Kevin Malone on The Office. And he made a drink for barbecue. And as it so happens, we are going to be having barbecue for dinner tonight. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to give a shot and make this cocktail that he made. It's a very simple one. It's an equal parts cocktail with rye whiskey And I used Elijah Craig because that's what I had, and I had never had this before. So it was also on sale, so I bought it. There are ryes that I like better. This one was pretty good. I'd say it's a little less spicy than I maybe like. It's maybe not quite as complex. So I'm a big fan of like some of the higher end Whistlepig ryes. I also really like Few rye, FEW, which is out of Chicago. But those are significantly more expensive. So for the price, this was really good. And it actually does work really well in cocktails. So it's 50% that. I did 1.5 ounces. And then 50% of this. This is Amaro Montenegro. So you've heard me talk about Amaro all the time. It's one of my favorite things to drink. And so this one is maybe a little bit more floral, or like, but cola like. There, it's got some of that, but all the very complex herbs and spices that you get from a standard Amaro. So it's again 1.5 ounces of that, and then Aztec chocolate bitters. So I added an orange peel on top because I just felt I wanted to brighten it up a little bit. And he served his on like crushed ice. Not necessarily how I would do it here right now where I live in the LA area. It is so hot that this stuff melts so quickly and it's going to over dilute your drink. So I think in the video, if I remember correctly, he was talking about like you don't need to use a big cube because you want the dilution. I do agree with that. But you can still get dilution from the big ice cube if you stir it in the glass with the big ice. And I should have done that, but I was trying to make it the way that he did. Also, the one thing I didn't do that he did was he shook it, which is odd because typically when you have an all spirits drink without citrus or cream or egg white, you stir. You don't shake. There's reasons why. Ask me in the comments if you want to know, but that's the rule of thumb. You would stir in a mixing glass. And so that's how I prepared this one. And then I did put it on the ice, but it's already been melting just while I've been sitting here getting my camera ready, my phone ready to take the shot. So I made one of these earlier today while I was making my notes for this video. Yeah, see, this is my problem. I did taste it before I put it in the glass, and it was good. I quite liked it. However, it's already started diluting, over diluting. I'm saying, and it could just be because it's so hot where I am. I'm right by a window with light coming in, and so and the sun's going down and it's hitting kind of partly this part of the house. And so, I think in hindsight, I would have put it on a big cube, which would have melted slower. And that would have helped with the dilution, but give it a try. I do agree. I think it goes or will go really well with barbecue. Just wanted another sip there. Okay. And then as far as what I was listening, this is really fun because I just got this in the mail yesterday. So this is Lewis in London, Louis Armstrong, from Verve. Now, I special ordered this, so it's on the special colored vinyl. But it's a concert recorded at the BBC in 1968, September 22nd, which is a cool day. It's one day off from being a super cool day, but it's a pretty cool day. But he just, this is Lewis just being the entertainer. He's like got the crowd wrapped around his finger and he's doing his classic songs with a great band. And, just pure Louis Armstrong. Like, so he does When It's Sleepy Time Down South. And then at the very end of the song, like he's done. And this was his introduction. Like he just walks on the stage, just does this song. There's no like hullabaloo or anything like that. He just launches right into it. And so then at the end of the song, when he's done, in his sing-songy, gravelly voice, he says like, "Good evening, everybody," because like that was his way of saying hello. It just killed me. I was like, because he does do that a lot. And my dad is a huge Louis Armstrong fan, so I grew up listening to Louis, and so this just kind of takes me back. But also these were versions of these songs live that I hadn't heard before because this is something that's never been published before, never been printed and distributed. So, Mac the Knife classic, When the Saints Go Marching In, one of my dad's two favorite songs, What a Wonderful World. But he's also a big fan of Stardust. But A Kiss to Build a Dream On is a great song. So anyway, great album. I think it's going to start hitting streaming services because it's now available for like public. You can just order it from anywhere. But mine has it again. It's got this cool kind of orange vinyl. And then they did this cool thing where there's 2 different color labels. So it's got this kind of like aqua blue, and then it's got this kind of like rust brick red, whatever you want to call that. But I would see if you can find this and check it out. And, listening to Louis Armstrong, it just makes me happy. He's just, even when he's singing a song that could be kind of sad, it just makes you feel good. And that's just kind of what I need right now. So I was just really excited that this came in the mail. And I said yesterday, I guess it must have come Saturday because yesterday was Sunday. So in any event, give it a listen. I really enjoyed it, and I will be listening to it again probably tonight as we eat dinner. So thanks for sticking through the bonus content. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you want to check this record out, or if you did, and then let me know what you thought about it. And thank you again. Cheers, and I will talk to you next time.